I'm Ellen Eisman, a New York Society Library trustee for many years and chair of the library board. I'm delighted to introduce two longtime friends, Sara Nelson and Francesca Stanfill. Sara is editor of the Falcon's Eyes, will interview the book's author, Francesca, after which they'll take questions. A bit about the background of our distinguished participants. Sara joined Harper in 2016 as vice president, executive editor, and special advisor to publisher Jonathan Burnham. She acquires fiction and nonfiction with an emphasis on historical fiction. In addition to Francesca, her authors include the New York Times bestselling author Jenna Blum and authors such as Simon Winchester, the revered historian, and the author of The Tattooist of Auschwitz. She's been the editor-in-chief of Publishers Weekly, as well as the editorial director for books and Kindle at Amazon. Francesca, also a library trustee, was born in Oxford, England, and grew up in New York City and Los Angeles. She's a graduate of Yale University, where her studies included the history of art and medieval history. Her articles have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times Magazine, New York, and Vanity Fair. Her lifelong fascination with the 12th century and its legendary queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, compelled her to write The Falcon's Eyes, her third novel. Please join me in welcoming two remarkable talents, Francesca Stanfill and Sara Nelson.
I just want to say that Ellen left out just a little tidbit about how she and I have known each other since we were 11 years old at camp in Maine. And then we met at Yale when we were all at Yale a few years later. I am thrilled to be here. I am so proud of this book. When I got the manuscript in, not last summer, was it 18 months ago? Mm-hmm. I was just completely bowled over. I knew my English history pretty well, but not as I came to know it, and certainly not as Francesca knew it. So we worked very closely together throughout the middle part of COVID, I would say, and had a marvelous time. I learned a tremendous amount. I have been incredibly impressed. I work with a lot of writers, many of them very, very good, obviously, and very accomplished, but what you really want in a writer is somebody who really, really cares, and really cares about her subject, and really cares about the process. And I have to say, I think Francesca wins that prize hands down.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask some questions, and Francesca, I'd like this to turn into as much of a conversation as possible. And as we have talked about the book a lot, we kind of know how to talk about it. And when we're at about the 40-minute mark, someone will give me a high sign and ask for questions from the audience, and we'll go from there. So I guess the first question is, and Ellen alluded to it in her introduction, you have always been obsessed with the 12th century. I mean, there are not a lot of people that I know who go around saying, I'm obsessed with the 12th century. The 18th century, maybe, but can you talk a little bit about the birth of this idea, which I know goes back a long way?
Well, it does, and it is really, the impetus was really a whole skein of lifelong yearnings and obsessions. I think I do remember reading about Eleanor when I was about 11 or so, because there were these biographies geared to young people. There was one on Queen Elizabeth, there was one on, Leonardo, and I believe there was one on Eleanor, but it really began, I think, my interest was piqued when I saw The Lion in Winter in the fall of 1968, where the elderly Eleanor is played so memorably by Katharine Hepburn. And as it turns out, the following summer, I went to France on one of the trips that I would take with my parents. And my parents had always been, were ardent travelers, and they were really intent on giving their children a broadening education. So we took these trips to Europe. They were always meticulously planned according to the Michelin guide. And we would go to the sites, 1-star, 2-star, 3-star. The 3-star was Ça vaut le voyage, and then it went down from there to intéressant. So we made these trips when my friends in California were playing tennis, going to the beach. I was touring damp cathedrals, following in the footsteps of the Normans in Puglia, descending into the occasional crypt. So on this trip, which was July 1969, on July 15th, 1969 to be exact, we were in France and we drove from Paris to the Loire Valley. And it was on that day that I first went to the Abbey of Fontevraud and saw the tomb of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And in fact, I was very diligent about keeping my travel journals. I would record where we stayed, what we ate, what room we had, and on July 15th, 1969, I wrote, this is a snatch from it, then to Chinon to see the ruins of the fortress where Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II met at Christmas court. Another stop at Fontevraud to see the abbey. We had to wait for a guide. He was quite knowledgeable, though. Saw the tombs of the Plantagenets, snugly nestled by the French in the abbey, away from the unrest of Westminster Abbey. Lovely church and breathtaking cloister, kitchen with Romanesque towers. Drove to Poitiers by 8, dinner, walk. And then the next one is quite telling. So we were on our way from Poitiers, we'd spent the night there, to the Périgord region to see the medieval pilgrimage site Rocamadour in the Périgord. And I wrote, we saw some lovely villages like Brive and Martel, where Henry's son died. The whole region is beautiful and full of Plantagenet history. One can almost imagine Eleanor and her sons plotting together. So that was the trip that ignited my fascination, and then I continued to read about her and study the Middle Ages when I went to Yale, and in travels.
Well, we talked about when we were talking about publishing the book, I went, as a good editor of the 21st century should do, onto Google and typed in the word Plantagenet. How many numbers, how many views do you think there were, sites related to the Plantagenets? 4 million.
4 million.
So that may have been articles or whatever, but 4 million. And I thought, yeah, maybe somebody would be interested in a book about this. This sounds like a good idea. Well, one of the things that we talked about a lot in the process, and also in the publishing process, when we were coming up with the subtitle for the book, was the point of view. As you know from reading the book, this is not Eleanor, my story. This is a book told it's the story of a young woman named Isabelle who eventually comes to live with and sort of study under the tutelage of the Queen in Fontevraud. But it is really very much Isabelle's story, and Eleanor is in the background for a lot of it. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that decision. I mean, you could have, obviously, you have great historical knowledge, and you could very easily have written my story by Eleanor of Aquitaine. So can you talk about that process a little?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say the most important decision, really, with any book is, well, especially for a novel, of course, is who tells the story. That's number one. And I did originally toy with the idea of writing it in Eleanor's voice, but I quickly discarded it because I felt that it would be far too limiting. Most importantly, because one of the aspects of Eleanor's persona, which so intrigued me, was her notoriety from the time she was a young woman, the young Queen of France, and throughout her lifetime, and indeed in history. I mean, her legend continues, it changes according to the tenor of the times. And so I wanted to show her how controversial she was, that I wanted to show how she was reviled by many and she was revered by many. And I wanted to be able to present that. And the only way I could do that, obviously, was have someone else tell the story. And so we could hear how others viewed her. And that was key. And I think it works well.
Oh, I think it works very well. It also, I think, allows you to, I mean, the book is historically accurate, but it allows you to leave some things out and compress some things. I mean, it is a novel, and if it were written even as a novel, but very much from Eleanor's point of view, I think you might have felt constrained by every piece of history.
Well, it would have been constraining, and really what I dreamt of writing from the very, really for many, many years, at the time I really was in college, was a sweeping, propulsive story that married scholarship with the imagination. And I could only do that in a novel, really.
Were there books that you, I mean, I know there were many, many books that you read, over the course of your lifetime to come to know all of this information. But were there books that you read either during the writing process or in advance of it that inspired you? Are there books that you would say kind of led you to write the book the way you wrote it?
I'm trying to think of an example, of a book that's told in that point of view. One doesn't immediately come to mind. What certainly did inspire me was, well, actually I would say that reading a lot of the biographies, obviously, the great historians of the period, many of the scholarly articles, which my friend Paul Friedman led me to, fascinated me because they raised questions about Eleanor. And questions about, her impact, for example, on women of her era. She was such a daring figure. She broke every rule. She orchestrated the divorce from her first husband and then her marriage to her second. I mean, she was the great force and also a great power broker. So I wanted to be able to explore all of that, to think how she would have affected, what impact she would have had on women of the time, what impact she would have had on a young woman of the time who met her, for example. So I think those were the inspiring things. In terms of other inspiration, I would say that for the voice of Isabelle, I did search for a kind of voice because I wanted a voice that was both archaic and accessible. And I thought of the letters of Eloise to Abelard, which I'd read in college, and I went back and looked at them and read them again. And then I found a wonderful recording of Claire Bloom reading them. And I'd listened to them, and again, in the car, walking, and that actually was an inspiration.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of writing? And I don't necessarily mean whether you use a pencil or a pen, but it was a labor of love of many years. We worked on it together for a year and a half or so. So can you talk about that?
Sure. Yes, we did work together, and I wrote the book without knowing whether it would ever be published. So when Sara, I had completed a 900-page manuscript with no publisher.
Right.
So I would say, in terms of the process, one of the hardest things, particularly in New York, which is a city geared to, what you're working on, get it out, everything's speed. It's a wonderful city and energizing, but it does not lend itself to the sort of romantic kind of, I mean, I had to protect that inner world from being intruded upon by other people in a way, because, not intruded, but I had to keep it whole in my head and just sort of protect it so that I could continue to create. And I think in terms of the process, I also struggle greatly with a very harsh inner critic, a little voice that would pipe up and say, you know, is this ever going to make sense to anyone? Is anyone ever going to read this? And then that was the inner challenge of that, which I had to sort of batten down. And then in the outer world as well, there were some moments that were less than confidence boosting. Years ago, I was in the midst of writing it, and I was on a plane going to Los Angeles. And the plane began to descend, and I was packing up my laptop, and the man sitting next to me, a businessman, turned to me and said, you know, I've been watching you. You've been working intently on this whole trip. You never stopped. Just curious, what are you working on? So I said, well, I'm writing a novel. And he said, oh, what's it about? And I said, it's set in the 12th century. And how long have you been working on it? And I said, 3 years. Oh, he said, I really admire you. I could never work that long and hard on something that had as little chance of success. Well, if it had been the beginning of the flight, I would have asked for the flight attendant for a double vodka or to change my seat, or both.
Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
But as it was, I just staggered off the plane. So, but his question, it was a question, by the way, that I don't blame him for that comment and that question. I mean, it was brutal, that's for sure. But I think it was a version of questions and thoughts that many people had and were reticent to express. So I think one of the daunting aspects of creating, you know, a long, complex book is a certain kind of fortitude. You have to think, you know, you have to be resilient, and you have to be tenacious. You just have to be enormously tenacious. In terms of the writing process itself, I think I have a little framed page with a couple of quotes by me on the computer, and one of them is, I think it's from Picasso, actually. Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working. And so it was the daily working, you know, as much as I can. I worked on holidays, I worked, you know, on planes, I worked every weekend, I worked after dinner. I just, as much as I could steadily work, that was a great help, because also the resistance and the sort of, you know, inner critic didn't tend to pipe up when I was constantly working at it.
Well, and also I think, I mean, you love the stuff, you know, you love
Yes.
the material. So, I mean, it's working. I don't mean to ever say that sitting at a computer is not working, but it's something you couldn't not do. It's always the way that
No, I had
felt
to
about
tell
it.
the story.
Right. Yeah.
I
Well, that
really
was very
felt
clear.
I couldn't, I had to see it to the end. Even if nothing came of it, even if I just did. And I felt that I would not be happy with myself if I didn't try.
One of the themes in the book is, you made mention of it a few minutes ago, is women discovering themselves, women forging ahead, women breaking the rules. Obviously, Eleanor was that person. But so was Isabelle, you know, chafing against restriction. And there are a lot of women in the book. There are some, quote, minor characters, Vestrada for one, Clementia for one, who are sort of supporting characters, but they are also all kind of versions of women who break the rules, or who are not completely following the rules. Can you talk about that? I mean, what is that? I mean, that's a very, I think it's a universal concept, but I mean, that to me was one of the things that made the book modern, set in this, in the 12th century, but with a lot of the same push and pull in these women's lives, motherhood versus non-motherhood. Fastrada is such a wonderful character because she's what my mother would have said. She makes the most of herself. I mean, there's not.
She does.
She is not a beauty, but she learns to project a certain kind of elegance. Clementia is her sister, who becomes a nun. Couldn't be more different character. So what is the thread here for you about women kind of creating themselves and interacting with the world in their own way?
Yeah, definitely, that's a theme in the book. Isabelle, of course, especially at the beginning of the book, her life is determined very much, not only to a great extent by the issue of control over her body, in the sense of the pressure that she has to produce an heir. And this looms large. And also you see with her, because this is a young woman with an inner life, who is literate. She's been taught to read and write by her grandfather, which was in itself unusual at the time. The same was true, actually, of Eleanor, who was highly literate and who had been taught by her family. She had a tradition of that in her family. So I think with Isabelle, of course, this is her personality from the very beginning. I mean, her family doesn't understand her. They don't understand her curiosity. They have no patience with her, storytelling and her dreams. And she, during her marriage, of course, that is the great issue. She questions everything, and she is in a society and in a marriage where she is not meant to question things. Fastrada, of course, is a little more of a freewheeling character, but she's living in Troyes, a very sophisticated region, city. She's older. So I don't get the feeling with Fastrada that she ever really struggled with this. I think, to a great extent, the women who, like Clementia, for example, the beautiful Clementia, Fastrada's sister, who becomes a nun, her strength comes from having a life of purpose. And she's an immensely capable woman. Here she is constrained within an abbey, and yet in a way she has tremendous freedom because she's doing what she wants to do. So I think the sense of purpose, the sense of being able to use your voice, just as much as being able to dictate the way your life is going. I think the freedom to expand your inner life, the freedom to make decisions, the freedom over decisions to do with your body. All of those loom large. And the question of also having a meaning in life, having work, having something that gives your life purpose other than motherhood or marriage.
Right, and those are universal questions. And the issue of pregnancy and motherhood and control over your body and, is still, the question is still with us. Also, I mean, you and I have been talking the last couple of weeks. I mean, this book opens with Eleanor's death, my queen, and my queen died today. It's a book to some extent about, I wouldn't say obsession, but the role of royalty in the lives of people, of commoners. And we were talking about how interesting it is that, we are, right now, this week, last week, we're living, through a period where the role of royalty is obviously is a very big deal right now, and people are thinking a lot about royalty and the future of royalty. And I wonder if you have some thoughts about that compared to and the
I don't.
obsession with royalty.
I think what I would say is that in terms of my book, what I find uncanny is that we should be having this talk tonight, the day after the funeral of the Queen, which was so really deeply moving and just deeply moving, of course, beautiful, but touched so many people. So I think in the past couple of weeks, we've thought a lot about the mystique and also the power of queenship. And I think that was definitely, that's definitely an enormous element of the Falcon's eyes. I don't think I'd want to speak about the future of royalty. I would accede to my friend, Sally Bedell Smith, who could speak about that much more. I will say that you do see certain things that have not changed, and one of them would be the eternal struggle of the heir and the spare. And you see that with Eleanor's sons, because you have Richard the Lionheart, who's constantly trying to placate his younger brother John. That's John of Magna Carta fame. John is a double dealer. He betrays him. Richard forgives him. John, when Richard goes off to crusade, John is doing all sorts of sneaky things and power-grabbing things behind his back. Richard forgives him. So you see that is a sort of eternal thing. I do think what's interesting is and what we've seen this week and in this funeral is how the mystique of the orb and the scepter, the being anointed, the power of queenship. Now, in Eleanor's case, she had real power. It was not, Queen Elizabeth could not make treaties. She couldn't go to war. She couldn't. Eleanor could.
Right.
She was a very, very canny and at times ruthless political strategist who helped in both of her sons' reigns. She raised the ransom when Richard the Lionheart was taken captive by the Duke of Austria after he returned home from the Third Crusade. And it was Eleanor who went from court to court and who pushed the barons and the churches in England to fork over the money for this enormous ransom. So she, beyond the mystique, beyond the pomp, she had real power. So she had soft and real power. Yeah.
A question I'm sure no writer really likes to hear, but what are you working on now?
What am I working on now? I'm well into a new novel.
I knew that. I wouldn't have asked you.
Set in the sort of mid to late 19th century, a century where I feel very much at home, probably when I should have been born, actually. And a very different kind of narrator, American, from Rochester, and a very different voice. And this will be you'll be glad to know, I mean, if it ever interests you, a taut story about focusing on, I think, self-invention, money, social ambition, and I envision it as having a kind of Hitchcockian feeling. As for the social ambition, money, all of this, obviously having covered the world of New York in the last Belle Époque, And living here for many years, I feel well equipped to write this book. So yes, I am working on it, and I'm champing at the bit to really get back to it.
I think, shall we open to
Sure.
questions? Ellen?
Okay, thank you. Francesca, I have a question for you, which is, having written this wonderful, very long book, when did you feel, or how did you feel, that you had reached the end of your research?
Well, I love research. I could have just kept on researching, to the end of time. You do have a visceral sense, I think, when you're done.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're never done. I think what I learned from writing this book was that I probably went overboard in what I felt I needed at the outset. And then as I worked and was working on specific chapters, if I was working on a chapter, for example, to do with the falconry, or Richard, or for example, the death of Richard the Lionheart at Chalut, or a specific scene, then I'd go back and research. And I also had a lot of files which I'd kept from my, which I kept throughout the process. And last week, when I was preparing for this talk, I opened a few of my file the drawers of my file cabinet, and I just glanced at a few of the labels of the files, and here's just a sample of them. Arab influence, communication, contraception and abortion, theories of, chronologies, costume, death of Richard, falconry, fall of Normandy, feast days, illuminated manuscripts, jewelry, Joanna of Sicily, Eleanor's beloved daughter, King John's mercenary captains, poetry, relic trade, the spice trade, travel, treasure hunts. So I had all these files. I have now, needless to say, a whole library of books on medieval history. But there is another method that is highly effective to know when you've reached the end, and that's when your agent calls you up and says, in a voice that sends shivers up your spine, surely you have enough. Surely you have done enough research. Enough is enough. And so when Lynn Nesbitt told me that, and I'll actually remember where I was sitting, and I practically was shaking, I thought, you know what? Okay.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it is easier to report. I mean, I used to be a reporter, and the writing is the part that's scarier, and
it is
and much
scary.
more
It's
active.
scary to plunge in.
So, and when we worked on it, I mean, there's, I think you didn't fall into this so much as some people do, where you want to get all your research onto the page, and every detail, and it's all very interesting because it is all very interesting, and because you want to avoid having to really think about it. So and you just want to get everything on the page, and some things need to cook differently. They need to sort of simmer in your head, and something that you spent 3 months researching might turn into a paragraph. But the story requires it to just be a paragraph, and you have to be willing to let the story
Well,
tell
the
you.
other tricky thing with writing a book set in, for example, set in the 12th century, or any historical novel, is to work in the history seamlessly.
Yes, right.
You want to work it in. You don't want, and you helped me so much with that, Sarah, because there were certain parts that you marked on the manuscript saying, no, this is sounding too textbooky.
Right,
it's
right,
too much.
right.
No.
The research is
And
shown.
you also really helped remind me to keep to the emotional heart of the book, which I think really does give it a certain pulse and throb as it moves forward. Because I'm an impatient reader, and I was myself, so I'm very aware of keeping it moving forward. And if it gets too textbooky, and if it is so tempting, and we cut several hundred pages. That is true.
100.
100? I think it was more than 100.
Yes, I want to express my compliment to your editor because it is so painful to just discard pages that you have spent so much time researching and creating. And the difficulty of keeping your objective voice is just so hard. So congratulations for putting it all together.
Sara was a wonderful, wonderful editor. I'm tremendously grateful to her because she really helped me. We chiseled parts of it particularly.
Right.
And
But that's the job. Thank you. But because it was all there, it sort of parts needed to be sort of excavated. But it was all there. And and movement, especially in a book that it needed to be long. I mean, I think I remember saying to Jonathan Burnham, our publisher at the time, I said, it's not going to, I promise you, Jonathan, it's not going to be 900 pages when we're done, but it is going to be 800. I mean, I didn't want him to think we were going to, cut it into a 200-page book or something. I mean, it needed to be, it needs to be a big book. It's a big subject. It was a big century. Eleanor was a big character.
then there were all the,
And
the
all
other
the characters.
characters.
Right. I mean, it was a big world. But it was all there. It just needed to be.
Well, it needs to be chiseled, and you need the objective. You need the editor, someone objective looking at. You're too close to it. You just can't see after a certain point.
So the end of the book seems like it's calling out for a sequel.
I have thought about it. All I will say is that I am keeping my library of medieval history books. Beyond that, I would say it was very hard to say goodbye to my characters. I had lived with them a long time, and they seemed very real. One of the greatest compliments and joys, I think, after publishing the book is to hear from readers who speak of the characters as if they were real people. That it is just so thrilling to me. So I do miss them. And I've thought of going back and doing a sequel, eventually doing a sequel. I do think that there is a lot of interesting material to be mined from the relatively, I think, unmined early 13th century. There is one figure particularly, not a woman, who really fascinates me, but we'll see. We'll see. First, I want to do this book because I'm excited about it now, and it will be in its own way a challenge. So I want to do this first.
You had a question, yes.
So I think this was the fastest I've ever read an 800-page book, I would say. I love this book. But I was a little confused partway through because it was a novel of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And then I realized that Isabelle was the main character, and Eleanor of Aquitaine wasn't really a main character, which was okay because I loved the character of Isabelle. But it got me very curious about Eleanor of Aquitaine, who I didn't know an awful lot about. So I was actually glad that the focus was Isabelle, which is such a wonderful character. Is there you have dozens and dozens of books. Is there a biography of Eleanor of Aquitaine that you would recommend out of all of the biographies?
I've thought about that. I'm going to answer that in two parts. One, the issue about Eleanor coming in later in the book. It is tricky in a way because it's a big draw. We did put a novel of Eleanor of Aquitaine.
We had a lot of discussions.
We had a lot of discussion.
We're still having them.
We're still having it for the paperback, yeah. But I feel very strongly that felt very strongly that, well, first of all, this was the way I envisioned the story, so it couldn't have been changed. And I really worked, and as I did drafts, I worked on, Eleanor hovers over the first part of the book, the way Rebecca hovers over the Du Maurier novel. You hear about her. Who is she? Who is she really? You know, you hear, and then you meet her. Now, the advantage to that in a very long book is that it adds a shot of hemoglobin to the middle of the book, the middle of the story, when stories, especially this length, can really lag. So that is an advantage to it. In terms of biographies, I wish I could say that there was one biography, you know, like if Robert Massey wrote about Eleanor or someone like, or, you know, someone like that. I can't really. The one that I depended on for this book was scholar Ralph Turner's book. There are others that are, you know, lovely. The classic one, the biography was by Amy Kelly in 1953. There have been others. There is a sort of more feminist approach from Marion Mead. Many of the French scholars, there's a French scholar, Régine Bernoux, who I think has written quite well about Eleanor. There are scholars, Martin Aurel in France, one of the great specialists on Eleanor and the Plantagenets. Whether I could say there is a book that really brings her to life, I don't know. I think you have to read The Falcon's Eyes.
I just wondered, because Eleanor was in prison for almost 16 years, so can you, how does that work into a powerhouse kind of thing?
Well, she took great risks. In the early 1170s, her sons were becoming restless, and also more than restless, they wanted more power, they wanted more responsibility. Their father, Henry II, was very jealous of handing over responsibility. The sons were restless, they were strong personalities. The young king, Henry, who eventually died, I can't remember exactly when he died, I think in the mid-1170s, I think. And Eleanor also was becoming disaffected with Henry. I've often wondered, and this was one of the questions that occurred to me, you know, I often wondered what she thought when Henry essentially had Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, murdered in the cathedral on December 29th, 1170. What was the impact of that on her, to see what her husband was capable of? That had to have made an impression. If he could do that, and it must have made an impression on the sons. And that murder was such a, I'm astonished actually I get the feeling that the news of his murder went like wildfire through the medieval world. It was like, I don't know, the assassination of John Kennedy. It was a momentous event. So I often wondered, what did she feel about that? What did the sons feel? So, and of course she was blamed for inciting the sons against their father, and eventually, and skirmishes and so forth, and eventually, as she was part of this rebellion, she was captured by Henry, I think at Chinon, and then taken in 1173 to the only place where he felt he could be free from her machinations, which was in the south of England, in Salisbury and Winchester. We're really not sure the exact times and where she was then, but it was in England. And it was, at first probably stricter and then basically house arrest. But can you imagine the impact on this woman who had traveled the world, who had been on the Second Crusade, who had had tremendous responsibility in her own region in the Aquitaine, shut up in this castle in England. So that's how that occurred. And then she was released finally released in 1189 when Henry died. And Richard, who many say was her favorite son, freed her.
I'm just quite curious about the fact that Eleanor had 11 children. I find this kind of astounding, being 11 children and being a feminist at the same time. I mean, she was, you could say, a feminist. You know, she had power and she used.
Yes, but she also had the issues. So first of all, she wanted to produce children for Henry. That was part of the power of being a queen and producing the heirs.
Right.
Remember, that was the big issue with her marriage to Louis. She only had 2 daughters whom she essentially, who had divorced from Louis, left pretty much forever. And then promptly went on to marry Henry and had first son William, who died in infancy, and then her second son Henry. And yes, she had, I think it was 10 children. William died in infancy, but basically she was pregnant almost every winter. And so, you know, that is also, you know, she was lucky in terms of, she had tremendous, rather like Queen Elizabeth, tremendous stamina. She was indomitable. You would have had to have, I did a lot of research about childbirth, methods of contraception, abortion, all theories of sex selection in the Middle Ages. And I can't imagine, I can't fathom what it must have been like to have born children, not only to born so many of them, but just to get through the process, just to endure it, just to survive it as a woman. It was remarkable, but she was clearly blessed in the DNA department. She was strong and healthy. She lived until she was 82, and she was productive all through her life. So when she died, she was practically a freak of nature. I mean, she was very old, about 78, when she crossed the Pyrenees to go to Spain to choose among her granddaughters the bride for the Dauphin of France. And here was one of the lacunae that I, enjoyed kind of exploring. This is an example. And I thought it was interesting. She did not choose the eldest daughter. She chose the second, Bianca. And she made the excuse that Urraca, the first name, was too difficult for the French to pronounce, which of course was nonsense, just nonsense. But I thought to myself, imagine her taking that perilous journey, really, across the Pyrenees in the winter. And then how did she know that this girl had the mettle of a future queen? How did she test her? So I write about that. I have her talk about that in a chapter in the book. Anybody else?
I kind of want to thank you for introducing her in this particular, at this particular time in terms of contemporary ideas about how women overcome the past to become the.
But I think it's Queen Elizabeth. I mean, I think actually Eleanor and Queen Elizabeth had many things in common, and one of them was, they had certain things in common. They both had long, productive lives. They were indomitable. They had been in the spotlight from the time they were young women. So yes, they had, and they were very brilliant in using the power that they did have. I was going to say something and now I can't remember what it was, about Elizabeth. I can't remember. Oh dear. Go back.
Anyone else? Just one more comment. You just gave us a little glimpse into your next project. And what instantly came to mind is a modern Edith Wharton.
Yes, well, yes, I love Edith Wharton. I love Edith Wharton. But I think this book will be more psychological, but not that it isn't. I don't know. I would say it's really hard for me to say because really I don't know what a book is about until I've written it. I really, when it comes right down to it, I'm not sure that I know that what anything's about until I've written about it. It's just the way I am.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so I think, you have feelings about books. You sort of, it's all gurgling inside you. You have these ideas, you're making notes, but you don't really know. If you have to sit down, the ideas come, you hope they come, scenes unfold, characters begin to speak to you, they dictate the action, and that's very thrilling. But we'll see. I'm certainly fascinated by hierarchies, by issues of class, and all of those, of course, would enter into a book that's set in the late 19th century. Yeah.
Sounds exciting.
Thank you.
There's a question in the back, yes.
If you were giving a talk to this group and not answering questions, what would be the one thing you would most want us to know about Falcon's Eyes?
That's a great question, Ricky. I think to know, I would say to come away with would be a sense of this fascinating century, the 12th century, that it was a kind of pre-Renaissance, full of wonderful characters, sort of the bold-faced names of their time, Eloise and Abelard, Saladin, Beckett, Richard the Lionheart. So that would be one that I would introduce you to readers to this era, and also, of course, Eleanor, and also I think, but most of all, I guess I would want the reader to be transported to this world, to be immersed in it, in the story, and to be able to identify with the themes in the book, which are really universal. That's what I would say.
I have a question. How did you decide what type of Falcon Eyes?
How did I decide? Well,
The title?
on the title. It came to me, well, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
Well, falconry looms large in the book,
Right.
and there is the real falcons,
Right.
and then there is a bronze falcon. I think the eyes of the falcon itself, of course, is a very complex creature, because it is under the control of the falconer, and yet not. It can also fly away at any moment. So, that brings in the control issue. The falcon's eyes,
As opposed to like maybe eagle's eyes, for example.
excuse me,
As opposed to like eagle's eye, the eagle's eye.
an eagle's eye. Well, I think I was also thinking of the falcon's eyes in the bronze falcon, because you see those eyes, and it's one of the, I think, elements of the book, the objects change in terms of the way they're perceived, or in terms of what they're associated with. And the falcon's eyes, which evolve, the feeling of the falcon's eyes, what they connote to Isabelle particularly, changes over the course of the book. So she's given the falcon's eyes, she's first wearing them, then it becomes a comfort, it changes. So I think as people change, as people evolve, and that was another aspect of the book that I really was intent on. The characters have to change through the course of this long book. They have to evolve, as people do evolve. And Eleanor has to evolve, and Isabelle evolves.
Right.
Earlier today, when I gave a talk, I mentioned that, in this regard, that years ago, when I was writing for the New York Times Magazine, I was interviewing, I spoke with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis for a piece I was working on. And it was on one of the books that she was editing then at Doubleday. And I remember where I was sitting. I was at my desk at the New York Times with my manual typewriter. Can you imagine? I might as well be speaking about the Paleolithic era. Anyway, Jackie, in the course of this, Jackie said to me, and I'll never forget, "You know how it is, Francesca, when you look back on your life, you don't really remember the person you were, like a snake shedding skins." And I thought that was so telling about Jackie, but I would suspect the same statement could have been made about Eleanor. I think she changed greatly. And the Falcon, and the way the Falcon is perceived, and the way his gaze is perceived, changes during the course of the book.
Thank you so much.